This is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and locations are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real persons or events is coincidental, created for entertainment purposes only. The morning after the great storm, 3 men set out through the snow. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. The world around them had been remade overnight. Fences buried, trees bent sideways, the familiar shapes of the land erased beneath a white silence so deep it felt like the earth itself had forgotten what it used to be. The men moved slowly, their boots breaking through crust with every step, their breath coming in short clouds that vanished into the still, frozen air. They were looking for a grave, not a grave anyone had dug. A grave the winter had made for them, 2 of them, a woman and her small boy, in that strange mound of frozen earth at the edge of the settlement. The one the whole town had laughed at. The one they called Solberg's Folly. Elias Croft led the way. He did not let himself think too carefully about what they would find. He just walked. His hands were still raw from 2 nights of feeding his own stove every 20 minutes, burning through wood he didn't have, fighting a cold that came through the walls of his well-built house like it owned the place. He had survived. He was not certain she had. The mound came into view through the pale morning light, almost completely buried. Only the tip of a metal chimney pipe broke the surface, and even that was ringed with ice. No smoke, no movement, nothing. One of the men behind him swore under his breath. Croft dropped to his knees and started digging with his bare hands. And then they heard it. A child laughing, muffled, distant, but unmistakable. The sound of a small boy delighted by something, rising up from beneath the snow like a message from another world entirely. The 3 men stopped, looked at each other, and then the snow shifted from the inside, pushed outward, and a wooden door swung open. Ingrid Solberg stood in the doorway with a shovel in her hands and the warm light of a kerosene lamp glowing behind her. She looked at the 3 frozen men in the snow. They looked at her. She stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." But that is not where the story begins. It begins 3 months earlier. On the last afternoon Ingrid Solberg would spend inside a house that was not her own. The funeral had been simple. A wooden box, a short prayer, a handful of frozen dirt thrown onto frozen ground. Her husband was gone, taken by an accident sudden enough to leave no time for goodbyes and no room for disbelief. She had stood at the graveside with Theo pressed against her side, his small hand in hers, and she had felt something close down inside her chest. Not grief, exactly, or not only grief. Something more like the sound of a door locking from the outside. Edmund Hale summoned her the same evening. He was seated behind his desk when she entered, a large man, solid as old timber, with a stillness that had never once doubted its own authority. He did not rise. He gestured to the chair across from him the way a man gestures to something he owns. The papers were already on the desk. He explained it without warmth and without cruelty, which was somehow worse than either. The property passed to him. The house, the land, the livestock, all of it, his son's, and therefore now his. The law was clear. He was not interested in debating it. Ingrid looked at the papers. She did not touch them. "And Theo?" she asked. "The boy is welcome to stay." He paused. "You are not." She was 38 years old. She had $11 in a tin box beneath the floorboards of a bedroom she was no longer allowed to sleep in. She had a son who was 8 years old and already too quiet, already carrying things no child should carry. And she had, somewhere in the back of her mind, the faint outline of something her father had told her once, about a piece of land at the edge of town, purchased years ago, never built on, waiting. She packed what she could carry. She did not look back at the house as they left. The cold met them at the door like it had been waiting. The land was not much to look at. A flat clearing at the edge of the settlement, rimmed by a thin stand of cottonwood trees stripped bare for winter. And on it, if you were generous with the word, a structure. A sod house, perhaps, once. Now mostly a collection of collapsed walls, and a roof that had given up entirely. One corner caving inward like a chest that had taken a hard blow. Theo stood beside her and looked at it without speaking. The wind moved through the broken walls with a thin, high sound. Not quite a whistle, more like something being slowly pulled apart. "Mama," Theo said finally. "I know. She walked toward it anyway. She always walked toward things anyway." Her father used to say that about her, always with a complicated kind of pride, as though he wasn't sure whether to be relieved or alarmed. Inside what remained of the walls, the damage was worse, and also, strangely, more manageable up close. The walls themselves were thick, 2 feet of packed earth that had held their shape even as the roof fell in. The floor was dirt but level. The stove, an old iron thing bolted to the far wall, was intact. Frozen solid and orange with rust, but intact. She pressed her hand against the inner surface of the nearest wall. Solid. Cold, but not the cold of something thin. The cold of something with mass. Something that would take a long time to change temperature in either direction. Her father had talked about this. Thermal mass, he called it. The property of a material that resists change. A thick wall of packed earth, he had told her once, was more intelligent than it looked. It did not let the cold in easily, but it also did not let the warmth out easily. It held. She looked at the roof, or what remained of it. The collapse was on the far side, the corner closest to the prevailing wind direction. She could see where the original construction had been weakest, the junction between the walls and the roof, where the sod bricks had never quite bonded to the wood frame, where moisture had gotten in over however many seasons and slowly, invisibly, done its work. The walls had held because they had no choice but to hold. They were essentially part of the earth. The roof had failed because it had been built to fight the weight above it, rather than to work with it. Her father would have had something to say about that. And in the corner that had been sheltered from the collapse, leaning against the wall as though it had simply been waiting for her to come and collect it, a leather-wrapped cylinder tied with a strip of rawhide. The kind her father used to store his drawings. She crossed the room and picked it up. The leather was stiff with cold, but unbroken. Her name was written on the outside in her father's handwriting, faded but legible. Her hand stilled. Inside the cylinder, rolled carefully around a larger set of drawings, was a small envelope, sealed. Her name again on the front, in the same hand. Smaller this time, as though he had written it quietly, meant only for her. She turned it over. On the back, 4 words. "Find the seam, Ingrid." She did not open it. Something in the weight of it, the patience of it, a letter that had waited this long already, told her it was not ready to be read yet. She tucked it into the inner pocket of her coat, against her chest, and turned to the larger drawings. She unrolled them slowly. Her father had been a shipwright. She had grown up watching him work. Watching him think about wind and water and pressure and tension, watching him build things meant to hold against forces that wanted nothing more than to break them open. The drawings in her hands were not drawings of a ship. They were drawings of a roof, a strange curved roof, a shell of animal hide stretched over a willow frame, the hide soaked and then pulled taut as a drumhead and left to freeze solid in the winter air. A hull, she thought. He built it, like a hull. Can we really live here, Mama? Theo's voice came from the doorway. He was looking at the collapsed ceiling, at the rusted stove, at the frozen dirt floor. His face was calm in the way children's faces go calm when they are trying very hard not to be frightened. Ingrid looked at the drawings. She looked at her son. She looked at the walls, thick, solid, patient, that had been waiting here all this time. Your grandfather built ships that crossed the North Sea, she said. We will build this. Theo was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way he did when he had decided to believe something. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood trees with a sound like the ocean. They had work to do. The first night, Ingrid did not sleep. She lay on the dirt floor beside Theo, wrapped in every coat and blanket they had brought, listening to the wind find its way through the broken walls. It came in cold and relentless, the kind of cold that does not announce itself. It simply arrives, settles in, and begins its quiet work. She could feel it at the back of her neck, at her wrists, moving up through the ground beneath her despite the blankets folded double underneath them. Theo slept. Children could sleep through anything, she thought. Or perhaps he was simply exhausted in a way that went deeper than discomfort. His breathing was slow and even. She watched the small rise and fall of his chest and told herself that was enough. That was the only thing that needed to be true right now. By morning, the water in the tin cup she had left near the stove was solid ice. She rose before the light came and looked at what they had. $11, 3 blankets, a change of clothes each, packed in the rush of leaving, half a sack of cornmeal, a pot, her father's drawings rolled back into their cylinder and propped against the wall, and in the inner pocket of her coat, still sealed, still waiting, the small envelope. She did not take it out. Not yet. Instead, she built a fire. The old iron stove was seized with rust, the flue pipe clogged with the debris of however many seasons had passed since anyone last used it. She worked for nearly an hour, clearing it piece by piece, her fingers blackening with rust and old ash. When she finally coaxed a small flame from the last of the dry grass she found piled in one corner, probably left by some animal that had been using the shelter long before she arrived, she held her hands over the heat and felt something loosen in her chest. Small fires, her father used to say, are more honest than big ones. A small fire tells you exactly what you have. What she had was enough for this morning. That would have to do. The third night, Theo's fever came. It arrived the way fevers do in children. Suddenly, completely. A heat so startling that when Ingrid pressed her hand to his forehead, she pulled it back before she could stop herself. He was shivering despite the warmth of him, that terrible contradiction of fever. And his eyes, when they opened, were glassy and far away. She had 3 matches left. The fire had gone out sometime after midnight. She had been sleeping too deeply, the exhaustion of 3 days of physical labor finally claiming her entirely. And now the stove was cold, and the room was the temperature of the outside world, and her son was burning up in the center of it. She struck the first match. It caught, wavered, and went out before she could get it near the kindling. Her hands were shaking. She made herself stop, made herself breathe. Her father's voice came to her then. Not a memory exactly, more like a presence. The way some voices stay with you, become part of the way you think. The flint and the steel, Ingrid. You always have those, even when you have nothing else. She found the small flint kit at the bottom of her coat pocket. She had carried it for years, a habit her father had insisted on so thoroughly it had become as automatic as carrying a key. She positioned the steel, struck again. On the fourth strike, a spark caught in the char cloth, and she nursed it with her breath, feeding it to the dry grass, willing it forward with everything she had. The fire took. She crouched over it until her knees ached, feeding it slowly, carefully, the way you tend something fragile that could still go either way. When it was finally steady, she hung the pot over it and melted snow for water and brought the warm cup to Theo's lips and held his head up and talked to him quietly about nothing in particular, about the drawings, about the shape of the roof, about the ships her father had built, the names he had given them. Theo drank without fully waking. His breathing slowly evened out. When the pale light of morning came through the gaps in the walls, his fever had broken. She sat for a long time after that, her back against the cold earth wall, her hands wrapped around the tin cup. Then she put it down, stood up, and went to find someone willing to sell her 3 fresh cowhides. She used the last good thing she had left. The ring came off stiffly. Her hands were swollen from the cold and the work. She held it for a moment in her palm. A plain band, worn thin on one side from years of wear. She did not let herself think too long about what she was doing. She simply closed her fingers around it, walked to the edge of town, and traded it to a rancher named Garvey for 3 of the largest, freshest hides he had cut that week. Garvey looked at her with the expression of a man who pities someone but has decided that pity is not his business. "Building up your walls, ma'am?" he asked. Ingrid folded the receipt and put it in her pocket. "Not the walls," she said. The work began in earnest. She had studied her father's drawings until she could close her eyes and see every line. The principle was simple in the way that true things are simple, not easy, but clear. A curved frame of willow poles bent and lashed together over the existing roof, creating a smooth dome shape that rose above the broken sod like the inverted hull of a boat. Over that frame, the hides, soaked, worked until pliable, pulled tight across the skeleton, and lashed down at every point with good rope. That was how she discovered she had an ally. She had come outside one morning to find a coil of rope simply there, quality she couldn't have afforded, along with several heavy iron tension fittings she recognized immediately as blacksmith work. No note, no knock on the door, just the materials, placed where she would find them, as though they had grown there overnight. She looked toward the smithy at the far end of the settlement. Gustav Brandt was visible in the doorway, doing something with a piece of iron, not looking in her direction. She stood there a moment. Then she went back to work. Gustav Brandt was 70 years old and had come from somewhere in the north of Sweden before she was born. He spoke to almost no one. He charged fair prices, did good work, and had survived more winters in this place than anyone else in the settlement, which gave him a quality of stillness that could be mistaken for indifference. It was not indifference. She understood that now. It was simply the patience of a man who had learned that most things reveal themselves in time, And that watching was more useful than talking. He had looked at her frame, he had understood what she was building, and he had said nothing, and helped her anyway. She did not go to thank him. She thought he would prefer it that way. The tension fittings he had made were extraordinary. She only understood this fully when she went to use them. Their design was subtle, the kind of subtle that looks simple until you try to improve upon it and discover there is nothing to improve. They allowed the rope to be tightened in small increments and then locked in place without slipping, distributing the tension evenly across the hide rather than concentrating it at a single point. She had never seen anything quite like them. She thought about the knowledge inside those fittings, the decades of metalwork, the winters he had watched, the things he had understood, alone in his smithy, that he had never put into words, and apparently never needed to. It was possible, she thought, that Gustav Brandt was the only other person in this settlement who had looked at her frame and immediately understood what it was trying to do. And he had responded the only way that mattered, by making it better. The first time Elias Croft came to look, she was working the second hide over the frame. He stood at the property line with his arms folded across his chest. A big man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had never learned to disguise what it was thinking. He watched her for a long moment without speaking. She could feel the weight of his assessment from 30 feet away. "Mrs. Solberg," he said finally. She didn't stop working. "Mr. Croft, that frame." He paused, choosing his words with the deliberateness of a man who considered himself an authority. "The pitch is wrong for snow load, and willow doesn't hold under sustained pressure. It fatigues. You'll be sitting under a failed structure before the hard cold comes." "The curve distributes the load," she said, "like an arch, like a hull." "This is not a hull. This is a house." His voice carried the patience of someone explaining something to a person they have decided is not quite capable of understanding it. Or it's meant to be. What you're building is... He stopped, seemed to weigh something. "It won't hold, ma'am. That is my professional judgment. I've been building in this climate for 20 years. Ingrid pulled the hide taut against the frame and lashed it down. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Croft." He stood there a moment longer, as though waiting for her to reconsider. Then he turned and walked back toward his own property, his boots crunching in the frozen grass. She heard him stop once, halfway across the clearing, and then keep going. She didn't look up. The name came that same week. She heard it first from Theo, who had been in town for his lessons and came home quieter than usual. She asked him what was wrong. He said nothing for a while. Then he said, without looking at her, "They're calling it Solberg's Folly." She was mending a harness by the stove. She kept her hands moving. "Who is?" "Silas Wren. At the store. He has a sign." A pause. Some of the boys were laughing. She set the harness down and looked at her son, at the careful stillness of his face, the expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when he was protecting her from knowing how much something hurt him. "Come here," she said. He came. She put her hand on top of his head. "Your grandfather's ships had names too," she said. "People named them after what they hoped for, or what they were afraid of, or sometimes both." She felt him lean, just slightly, into her hand. "A name isn't a verdict. It's just a word someone said out loud." Theo was quiet. Then, "What will we call it?" She looked up at the curved skeleton of willow poles through the gap in the roof where the sky showed gray and enormous overhead. "Home," she said. He thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded, the way he did when he had decided to accept something. He didn't stop being quieter after that, but she noticed he stopped flinching when someone said the name. Finn arrived on a Tuesday. Theo found him at the edge of the refuse pile at the far end of the settlement, a brown dog of indeterminate breeding, thin to the point of transparency, with a matted coat and the defeated stillness of an animal that has stopped expecting much from the world. He had been someone's dog once, that was clear. The way he watched Theo approach, not running, not growling, just watching with large and careful eyes, spoke of a creature that had known kindness and was trying to determine whether this was that again. Theo came home with the dog at his heels and looked at Ingrid with an expression of combined hope and preemptive apology. "He was at the dump," he said. "Someone left him." Ingrid looked at the dog. The dog looked at Ingrid. His tail moved once, a tentative half-wag that seemed to surprise even him. She thought about the food they didn't have enough of, the space they didn't have enough of, the things that were already too difficult without adding another living creature to keep alive through what was coming. "One condition," she said. "He works for his place here. He watches at night." Theo's face opened up entirely. The full, uncomplicated happiness of a child who has not yet learned to be cautious with his relief. He dropped to his knees and the dog walked into his arms as though he had been waiting for exactly this. She turned away before her expression could betray anything. That night, Finn lay across the doorway and slept there without being asked. The county inspector arrived on a morning when Ingrid was working on the upper frame, balanced on a rough wooden ladder, both hands occupied with rope and fitting, covered in wood shavings and the smell of fresh rawhide that had become so constant she barely noticed it anymore. She climbed down when she saw him coming. He was a precise man in a cold weather coat, with a kind of careful face that gave nothing away. He introduced himself, stated his purpose, and walked around the structure twice without speaking, making notes in a small book. Then he told her, the dwelling did not meet the minimum standards for habitation. The walls required reinforcement. The roof. He glanced up at the frame with an expression she could not quite read. Was non-compliant in its current state. She had 30 days to bring the structure into conformance with county standards, or the matter of the child's welfare would be referred to the appropriate authority. He said it without malice. That was the thing about institutional cruelty. It didn't require any. After he left, she stood in the yard for a long time. The cold worked at the back of her neck. Finn appeared at her side and pressed his head against her knee. That evening, after Theo was asleep, she sat at the small table with the lamp turned low and let herself look at it plainly. All of it. The 30 days. The official language of the notice in her hand. The powerlessness of being a woman with no property, no legal standing, and no one to argue her case who wouldn't charge more than she had. The thought came quietly and without drama. She could go to Edmund. She could tell him she had reconsidered. That she would accept the arrangement he had originally proposed. Her presence tolerated in exchange for her usefulness to the household. Theo raised under his roof. The question of the land quietly dropped. Theo would be warm. He would have regular meals. He would not have to go to sleep hearing his mother work by lamplight long past the point when her hands stopped cooperating. She looked at the coat hanging on the hook by the door, the inner pocket, the sealed envelope still waiting there. She looked at the drawing on the wall, the copy she had traced by hand before the originals were still hers, every line reproduced in her own careful script, pinned to the sod beside the stove where she could see it while she worked. Finn had settled at her feet. He let out a long, slow breath and tucked his nose under his paws. And then Theo spoke from the darkness of his sleeping corner, not loudly, almost to himself, the voice of a child not entirely sure he was awake or dreaming. "Papa's drawing is still on the wall, Mama." She sat very still. She folded the county notice, put it in the tin box under the floorboard, turned up the lamp, and went back to work. Harlan Marsh came for the first time on the pretext of Theo's lessons. He was the settlement school teacher, a quiet man, perhaps 45, with the kind of worn-in face that suggested he had once expected different things from his life, and had arrived at a peace with what he'd gotten instead. His wife had died some years earlier. He taught the children of the settlement in a small room attached to the church, and was considered by most to be unremarkable, which Ingrid suspected he preferred. He arrived at the door with a cloth-wrapped loaf of bread and the explanation that he liked to check on his students' home situations when attendance was irregular. Theo had not, in fact, been irregular. Ingrid didn't mention this. She thanked him for the bread, poured him a cup of coffee, and answered his careful questions about Theo's progress with the patience of a woman who knew she was being checked on, but had decided not to take offense at it. He was doing it kindly. That was not nothing. He stayed perhaps 40 minutes. Before he left, without being asked, he repaired the loose hinge on the door that had been bothering her for a week, pulled a small tool from his coat pocket, and fixed it in 3 minutes with the ease of someone who repairs things as a matter of instinct. She noticed that. She didn't say anything about it. He came back 4 days later, then 3 days after that. He always had a reason. Once it was a question about Theo's reading. Once it was a small bag of oats he had extra. Once it was simply that he had been passing and noticed the frame had a section that looked unevenly tensioned, and he thought she might want to know. That last time, Theo looked up from his book and watched Harlan point out the problem in the frame, and watched his mother listen with her head slightly tilted, the way she listened when she was actually considering something. And something in the boy's expression shifted. Quiet and considering, like a piece fitting somewhere he hadn't known there was a space. He didn't say anything, just looked back at his book with the smallest possible smile. The truth was that Theo had been changing in ways that Ingrid had been watching carefully and saying nothing about. He had begun coming outside to help without being asked, not dramatically. One morning, she simply looked up from where she was working, and he was there, holding the end of a rope she needed held, positioning himself without instruction at exactly the right angle. She had not said anything. He had not said anything. They had just worked. He asked his first technical question on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week. Not a child's question, not a curious question, but the specific, probing kind of question that comes from someone who has been turning a problem over in their mind for some time and has finally found the right way to phrase it. "The dome shape," he said. "If the snow lands on a flat roof, it sits there, but on a curved surface, it wants to slide off. So are we building the curve for the air? Or for the snow?" She had put down what she was doing and looked at her son. "Both," she said. He nodded slowly. "So the cold can't come in, and the weight can't build up." "Your grandfather would have put it exactly that way," she said. Something in his face, something careful and held close, opened for just a moment. Then he picked up his end of the rope again, and they went back to work. She did not make much of it. She simply stored it away in the place where she kept the things that mattered, and went on. The night the first hard frost came, Ingrid lay awake and listened, not from cold this time. The stove was burning slow and steady, the room holding its warmth in a way that had begun to feel, tentatively, like something she could trust. She lay awake because she was listening to the stove, to the wind, to the structure around her that she had spent 3 weeks of her life building against every reasonable argument for abandoning it. And then she heard something new, a sound from above her, faint, high-pitched, almost too slight to catch. Not the groan of wood under pressure or the rattle of a loose fitting. Something else entirely. She recognized it after a moment. It was the sound of fibers contracting. She had heard it in her father's yard as a child, on the mornings after a hard frost when the great ships sat in their cradles and the rigging tightened in the cold, singing to itself in that thin, precise key. The sound of tension doing its work. The sound of something pulled tight becoming tighter still. She got up, put on her coat, went outside. The world was white and still, the frost glittering on every surface in the moonlight. She walked around the structure slowly, the cold sharp in her throat with every inhale, looking up at the roof. Then she stopped, raised her hand, knocked her knuckles against the hide surface. The sound that came back was not the dull give of cured leather, not the soft compliance of a material still flexible, still negotiating with the world. It was solid, dense, resonant. She struck it again. The sound rang out in the frozen air, clean and hard and certain, like knocking on the hull of a ship built to cross a serious sea. The hide had frozen solid, every fiber locked in place, every inch pulled taut by the cold itself, tighter than any rope could have managed. The surface was seamless, not a crack, not a gap, not a single place for the wind to enter. She stood there in the moonlight and let herself feel it. Not triumph exactly, something quieter. The satisfaction of a thing understood correctly, worked on faithfully, and arrived at exactly as intended. She had built a hull. Now she needed the storm. She was turning back toward the door when she heard footsteps on the frozen ground. Slow, deliberate, stopping a short distance away. She turned. Elias Croft stood at the edge of the clearing. He had clearly been walking back from somewhere and had stopped when he saw her, or perhaps when he saw the roof. He stood with his hands in his pockets, looking up at the frozen dome in the moonlight. His expression was unreadable from this distance. She watched him look at it. She had learned, over these weeks, to read the way different people looked at her structure. The dismissive glance, the curious examination, the uncomfortable avoidance. What Croft was doing now was different from any of those. He was looking at it the way a craftsman looks at something he needs to understand, systematically, starting at the base and moving upward, checking the eave line, following the curve. A man who has spent 20 years building things in a climate that punishes mistakes does not look at a structure the way other people look at it. He looks for load paths. He looks for weak points. He looks for the places where the design has made a decision and asks himself whether it was the right decision. She watched him look and did not know what conclusion he was reaching. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. After a long moment, he turned and walked back toward his own house, his footsteps even and unhurried on the frozen ground. She watched him go. She went inside. She banked the fire. She lay down beside her sleeping son. And for the first time since they had come to this broken place with nothing, she slept. Act 3. The color of a bruise. The lawyer came on a gray morning when the sky sat low and heavy over the settlement like a lid pressed down on something trying to escape. He was not a cruel man. That was almost the worst part. He was simply efficient. The kind of person who has learned to carry bad news without absorbing any of it, to deliver difficult things with the clean precision of someone who has separated the message entirely from its consequences. He introduced himself at the door, declined the offer of coffee with a small polite gesture, and placed the papers on the table with the care of a man who understood the weight of what he was setting down. Ingrid stood across the table from him and read the document without sitting. The drawings, he explained. They had been identified as marital property. Assets belonging to the Solberg household at the time of her husband's death, and therefore subject to the estate settlement Edmund Hale had filed. The original technical drawings she had been using were to be surrendered to the estate's representative. If she had made copies, those were to be surrendered as well. She had 24 hours to comply. Failure to do so would result in a formal complaint being added to the existing matter of the dwelling's compliance status, which... He paused here, looked at the document, looked back at her, remained unresolved. He was sorry for the inconvenience. She looked at the papers for a long moment. Then she walked to the wall where the drawings were pinned and took them down. She rolled them carefully and slid them back into the leather cylinder they had traveled in. She tied the rawhide strip. She held the cylinder for a moment with both hands. Not long. Just a moment. Then she set it on the table in front of him. He tucked it under his arm, nodded once with the distant courtesy of a man completing a task, and left. The door closed. Ingrid stood at the table with her hands flat on the surface and looked at the wall where the drawings had been. The two small nail holes. The faint ghost of a rectangle on the sod where the paper had kept the dust from settling. Finn came and stood beside her. She didn't move. Theo was at his lessons. She was glad for that. She stood in the empty room with the empty wall and let herself understand, plainly and without flinching, what had just happened. The drawings were gone. The record of the method. The precise angles of the frame. The specific calculations her father had worked out over years of thinking about wind and tension and air was no longer in her hands. She still had the structure itself, still had the knowledge in her body from weeks of building it, still had Gustav's rope and fittings and the frame she had already raised and the frozen hide shell that had rung like a drum in the midnight frost. They could take the paper. They could not take what she had already built. She pushed herself off the table and went back to work. But the work was harder now, not in her hands. Her hands knew what to do, had learned the rhythms so thoroughly that she could work in the dark if she had to. The hardness was somewhere else. It was the weight of doing something alone that you know to be right, in a place where no one around you believes it, after the last piece of evidence supporting your position has been taken away. She kept the motions going. She reinforced the connections along the eave line where the hide met the frame. She checked the tension fittings Gustav had made and found two that needed adjustment and adjusted them. She cleared snow from the area around the base where drifting had begun to build against the lower frame in a way she didn't want. Harlan came in the afternoon with Theo and stayed to help stack the additional sod she had cut for the interior walls. He didn't ask about the empty wall inside. She thought perhaps he had heard. Things moved quickly through a settlement this size. Or perhaps he simply understood, from the quality of her silence, that there were things that did not need to be named right now. He stayed until the light went. When he left, he paused at the door. "The frame looks right," he said. Not consolation, an observation, stated plainly. She nodded. He went. She put Theo to bed and sat at the table in the lamplight and tried to read and found she couldn't. She put the book down. She sat with her hands in her lap. After a while, she reached into the inner pocket of her coat. The envelope was still there. It had been there since the day she arrived, pressed against her chest through every hour of this, through the fever and the frost and the inspector and the lawyer and the 30 days and the empty wall. Her father's handwriting on the front, 4 words on the back. She held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. Then, in the stillness of the late winter night, she broke the seal. Inside were 2 things. The first was a single folded sheet of paper, covered in her father's careful hand. The same deliberate script he had used for everything, as though he approached writing with the same patience he brought to his drawings. The second was a smaller document, folded separately, official-looking. She set it aside and read the letter first. He had written it during the last weeks of his illness, he said, not because he was certain she would need it, but because he was a man who built things to hold against forces he hoped would never come, and he had learned long ago that hope and preparation were not the same thing. He had purchased the land the year after her mother died. He had never built on it because he hadn't known what to build. He had known only that he wanted her to have something entirely hers, that could not be claimed by a husband or a husband's family, or any legal arrangement that did not put her name first. He had thought about it for a long time, and then he had done the only thing he knew how to do with a problem that mattered. He had solved it like a shipwright. The technical drawings he wrote had always been secondary. They were good drawings. He had spent a long time on them, and he believed in the method. But they were not the thing. The thing was the seam. In every hull he had ever built, the seam was where you put what you most needed to protect. The place that looked like nothing. The place no one thought to look. She stopped reading, picked up the second document. It was a deed. Her father's name at the top as grantor. Her name, her full name, the one she had been born with, her father's name behind it. As grantee. The land, the entire parcel, transferred directly, without her husband's name, without the Hale family's name, without any connection to the estate that Edmund had filed and the lawyer had visited to protect, dated before her marriage, witnessed and recorded by a clerk 2 days before her father died, official, sealed, unassailable. She sat with the document in her hands and felt the room very still around her. Edmund had sent a lawyer for the drawings. The drawings were his now. He had taken them carefully, officially, with the full weight of the estate settlement behind him. He had taken the paper that held the shape of the walls. He had not known, could not have known, that the walls were never what her father had been protecting. She thought of the 4 words on the back of the envelope. Find the seam, Ingrid. She thought of how long this document had been pressed against her chest, waiting. She thought of the lawyer's careful, efficient hands, tucking the leather cylinder under his arm and walking away, satisfied. She sat with the document for a long time before she moved. She thought about her father in the last weeks of his life, writing that letter in his careful hand, thinking through every step of what he was doing and why. He had known he was dying. He had known what would happen to her after. Not the specific details, not Edmund Hale's name or the exact shape of the loss, but the general shape of it. He had known the world well enough to know what it did to women who were left alone in it without something solid under their feet, and so he had built her something solid, not a house. He hadn't known what to build. He had said so himself. But a foundation, a legal fact, a piece of paper recorded in a county office that said her name on it and meant it, that no estate settlement could touch because it predated the marriage that made estate settlements possible. He had hidden it in the seam, she thought. I did not know I was carrying this the whole time, she thought. He knew I would need it before I needed it. She thought, this is what it means to be loved by someone who builds things. She folded the deed slowly and carefully and put it in the tin box under the floorboard, the one that had once held $11 and now held something worth considerably more. She went to bed. She slept better than she had in weeks. She was awake before dawn when she first noticed Finn. The dog had been restless since the previous evening. Not distressed exactly, but unable to settle. He kept rising from his place by the door, walking to the window, returning, lying down again. She had assumed it was nothing. Now, in the darkness before the day came, she lay and listened to him pace and understood, with a certainty that came from somewhere below reasoning, that it was not nothing. She got up, put on her coat and boots, and went to the door. When she opened it, the cold met her like a wall. Not the ordinary cold she had grown accustomed to, that daily companion she had learned to work within and around. This was different. The air had a pressure to it, a stillness that was not peace, but the absence of movement in everything that usually moved. No wind, no creak of frozen wood, no sound from the settlement at all. She looked at the sky. It was the wrong color. Not the gray-white of ordinary cloud cover, not the pale blue of a clear winter morning. A yellow-gray, the color of a bruise in an old place that had been pressed too many times. The horizon to the northwest was darker still, a deep, greenish thing that her father would have called on water, a warning. Her ears did something strange, a subtle shift in pressure, there and then gone. The kind of sensation that happens sometimes on a high ridge or in a deep cellar, as though the air itself was being rearranged. She knew this feeling, not from this place, from childhood, from the harbor, from her father pointing at the water on certain mornings and saying quietly, "We don't go out today." She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Finn pressed against her leg. Then she went inside, woke Theo, and told him to get dressed. She went to Silas Wren first because the general store was closest and because it was the place most people passed through in the morning hours. Wren was behind his counter when she came in, and he had the expression of a man who has been expecting something mildly irritating and has arrived at the point of simply wanting to get through it. He listened to what she said with his arms folded and his eyes on a point slightly above her head. When she finished, he looked at her with the condescension of a man who has been managing a community supply store for many years and has developed firm opinions about the nature of reliable information. "Mrs. Solberg," he said, "I have lived in this settlement for 11 years. I can tell you from significant experience that the sky looks like that every other week in winter." "Not this way," she said. "The pressure—" "With respect," he said, in the tone of someone who means no respect whatsoever. "You've been here one season. You are not in a position to assess significant weather patterns." She looked at him steadily. "Please, at minimum, check your stores. Bring extra wood inside." He smiled with his mouth and not his eyes. "Thank you for your concern," he said. "Was there anything you needed to purchase?" She left. Reverend Cray was in the church organizing the week's texts when she arrived. He was a man who wore his authority like a physical garment, always composed, always positioned slightly above the situation, benevolent in the manner of someone who has never seriously doubted that his perspective is the correct one. He listened to her with his hands folded on the lectern and his head tilted at the angle of careful pastoral attention. "The animals are disturbed," she said. "The pressure in the air has changed. My father taught me to read these signs. Something serious is coming." Reverend Cray nodded slowly. "I understand your concern," he said, "and I respect that your father was a man of considerable practical knowledge." A pause. "But you'll understand if I note that the governance of weather is not within the province of animal behavior to predict. That lies, as it always has, with Providence. I'm not asking you to predict it," she said. "I'm asking you to prepare." "We are always prepared," he said, with the serenity of a man who has never been cold in his own church. "That is the nature of faith." She left. She went to 4 more houses. At 2 of them, she was not unkindly received. A woman named Dora listened with genuine attention and said she would speak to her husband, and an older man named Willett, who had been in the settlement from its earliest days, stood on his porch and looked at the sky for a long moment and said nothing and went back inside. She didn't know whether he had believed her or simply grown too tired for the conversation. At the last house she tried, a young man came to the door and listened for approximately 15 seconds before calling back over his shoulder to someone inside. "The Folly woman says there's a storm coming." Laughter from inside. Then, to Ingrid, with the amiable cruelty of someone who has never thought seriously about what it means to be wrong. "Maybe it'll blow your tent down, Mrs. Solberg." The door closed. She stood on the step for a moment. Finn sat beside her. The sky to the northwest had deepened to the color of a bruise pressed hard. She went home. She brought in every piece of wood they had. She filled the water vessels and set them near the stove. She packed the gaps around the door frame with strips of cloth and ran a rope from the door handle to the iron ring she had driven into the wall for exactly this kind of securing. She checked every lashing on the frame, every tension fitting, every point where the hide met the wood, and found nothing loose. Then she made dinner. Bean soup with the last of the salt pork, enough for tonight and enough left for tomorrow. She set 2 bowls on the table and called Theo, and they ate together in the warm, quiet room while the lamplight made their shadows large on the walls. "Mama," Theo said partway through his bowl, "the sky looks funny." "I know," she said. "Are we going to be all right?" She looked at her son, at his careful, serious face, so like his father's in the structure of it, but something else entirely in the expression. Something he had grown into over these weeks. Some quality of steadiness she had watched emerge from him, the way a ship emerges from a dry dock, gradually, unmistakably, as something meant to hold. "We are going to be all right," she said. "This house was built for exactly this." He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his spoon and went back to his soup with the equanimity of a child who has decided to trust someone. After dinner, she washed the bowls and banked the stove and made sure Theo was settled and warm. She checked the door, lashing one more time. She checked the window fitting. She stood in the center of the room and listened to the quality of the silence outside. That deep, pressurized absence of sound that had been building since morning. She was pulling on her coat to do one final check of the outer lashings when it happened. Not gradually, not building from a distant rumble or a rising wind that gave warning and time for adjustment. It arrived the way very few things in life truly arrive: complete, instantaneous, and total. One moment the world outside was silent. The next moment it ceased to exist. The sound was not wind exactly, or not the wind she knew, that familiar voice of moving air. This was something that had given up any pretense of being weather and become instead a physical force, a presence, a thing that filled every available space outside the walls with a roaring so enormous it had its own weight. She could feel it in her sternum. She could feel it in the floor beneath her feet. The door shuddered. The walls did not. She finished tying the lashing and stepped back into the center of the room. The lamp burned steady. The stove ticked with the slow, satisfied rhythm of a low and patient fire. The temperature in the room did not change. She stood in the middle of that warmth for a moment and simply felt it. The room was perhaps 12 feet by 14, small enough that two people living in it always knew exactly where the other was, small enough that Theo's cough at night carried to her without any effort, small enough that some mornings it felt like living inside a thought, but it was warm. Not the aggressive, fighting warmth of a stove pushed to its limit and still losing ground. Not the warmth of a house conducting its heat straight out through the walls and requiring constant feeding just to stay ahead of the cold. This was something different, still, self-contained. The warmth of a closed system, a sealed space. A hull that had been built not to fight the water, but to refuse it entirely. The distinction mattered more than she had words for. Outside, the world screamed. Inside, there was warmth, and a sleeping boy, and a dog stretched across the threshold, and the small circle of lamplight that had been here every night since she built this place, and would be here in the morning. Ingrid sat down at the table and folded her hands and waited. She did not wait long. The first knock came perhaps 2 hours into the storm. She heard it only because she was listening. Beneath the sustained roar of the wind, it was a small sound, a human sound, the kind of sound that requires a person to make. She was at the door before the second knock came. She opened it against the pressure of the wind with both hands, bracing with her shoulder, and the cold swept in like a living thing trying to follow the sound back to its source. Elias Croft stood on the threshold. He was covered in snow from the waist down, his coat plastered white, his beard frozen to a solid mass. Beside him, pressed against his side, were two children. A boy of about 12 and a girl who could not have been more than 4, the smaller one with her face tucked against her father's chest and her lips already past pink. Behind him, barely visible through the screaming white, the outline of his wife, one hand on his shoulder, unable to see anything ahead of her. Croft did not speak. He was past speaking. He looked at Ingrid with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the assessment, not the authority, not the careful professional judgment. Just the raw, unmediated face of a father who has run out of options. She stepped back and pulled the door wide. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." They came in, and they kept coming. Silas Wren arrived an hour later, alone, having burned through his furniture and his floorboards, and still felt the cold pressing through every wall of his well-stocked, properly built, wholly inadequate store. He stood in the doorway with the expression of a man who has had an argument with reality and lost definitively. And he did not speak either. Not right away, just stood in the warmth like someone who had forgotten. Warmth was a thing that existed. Reverend Cray came after midnight. The church had held, but not its windows. And without glass, the wind had the run of the place, and the temperature inside had dropped to a degree that had clarified his thinking considerably. He came in and sat against the far wall, and did not say anything to Ingrid, and she did not say anything to him. And then, in the deep hours of the night, when the storm had reached the pitch of something that had stopped being weather and become instead simply the world's true condition, its realest and most honest face, she heard the last knock. She already knew who it was. Edmund Hale stood in the storm without a lantern, without a guide rope, having navigated from wherever he had sheltered first through the absolute blindness of the blizzard by some combination of memory and stubbornness that she thought was probably characteristic of him. His coat was soaked through. His hands, when the light caught them, were white at the fingers. He looked at her. She looked at him. He did not speak, did not explain, did not ask. She opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." He came in. The door closed behind him, and in the small, warm, lamplit room her father had designed and her hands had built, the storm raged outside like a thing that had never learned that some doors simply would not open to it, no matter how long or how hard it knocked. 14 people in a room built for 2. That was the arithmetic of it. Plain, unarguable, and somehow beside the point. Because the room was warm. That was the fact that mattered, the one that organized everything else around it. The room was warm, and outside the walls, the world had become something no one in that room wanted to think about too carefully, and so they pressed together in the small golden circle of the lamplight and breathed the same air, and did not, for the most part, speak. Ingrid moved. That was what she did while others sat stunned against the walls. She moved because movement was what she knew. Because standing still in a crisis was the one thing her father had never once permitted himself or his daughter. She assessed the room the way she had assessed the broken sod house on the day they arrived. Plainly, without sentiment. Looking for what was workable. The stove was the center of it. She built the fire up from its banked state, slowly, not wastefully. She had enough wood for 3 days if she was careful, perhaps 2 if she was not. She put water on. People who had come through cold like that needed warmth from the inside as much as from the air around them, and warm water with a little cornmeal stirred into it would do more good than anything else she had. She organized the sleeping without asking permission, the children closest to the stove, the adults in a ring around them. The 2 women, Croft's wife, a quiet person named Marta, and a young woman from the Wren household who had come with Silas without Ingrid quite registering her arrival, were given the 2 blankets she kept for a life she had been planning rather than the one she was living. Everyone else managed with coats and layering and the simple animal warmth of bodies pressed close together in a small space. Edmund Hale sat against the far wall and did not ask for anything. She brought him a cup of warm water anyway. He took it without looking at her. She did not look at him either. Gustav arrived in the 2nd hour. She hadn't thought to worry about him. He was a man who had survived more winters than anyone else in the settlement, and seemed, in some fundamental way, to have arrived at an arrangement with difficult weather that precluded being surprised by it. But when she opened the door against the wind to check the outer lashings and found him standing there with 2 extra blankets under his arm and a calm expression, she felt something in her chest release that she hadn't known was clenched. He came in without ceremony, looked around the room, assessed it with the same unhurried attention he brought to everything, and sat down near the door in the place that needed the least warmth, leaving more of the stove's reach for those who needed it more. Theo was awake by then, sitting up in his corner with Finn beside him, watching the room with the wide-eyed, careful attention of a child taking in something he understands is important to understand. He looked at Gustav, and Gustav looked back at him, and something passed between them. Some acknowledgement of the situation that didn't require words. "You've done well," Gustav said. Not to Ingrid specifically, to the room, to the structure itself, the walls, the ceiling that held, the warmth that had no right to be here, and was here anyway. Nobody answered him, but something in the room settled slightly. The way things settle when someone whose opinion has weight says the thing that needed to be said. It was Gustav who first told the story about his homeland. They were deep into the night. The storm had not lessened, showed no sign of lessening, had in fact reached a kind of sustained pitch that stopped being frightening and became simply the condition of the world, the permanent new fact of existence. And the room had grown quiet. The particular quiet of people who have nothing left to do but wait and are too tired for anything except the simplest conversation. He began without preamble, as old men sometimes begin things, as though the story had been running in his head for a while, and he was simply letting it out. He spoke of a winter from his youth, in a village set between a fjord and a mountain in the far north of his country. A storm that had come much as this one had come, sudden, total, a thing that arrived in the night and stayed for 4 days. He had been a boy then, perhaps Theo's age. His father had built their house with the knowledge that comes from generations of people who have lived through exactly this and learned, slowly and at great cost, what holds and what does not. The house had held, others had not. What he remembered most, he said, was not the storm itself, but the morning after. The specific quality of the light on the snow, the silence that was entirely different from the silence before. The way people moved through the village with the care of those who have just been reminded that surviving is not guaranteed and should not be taken as a permanent condition. He paused for a moment. The room was very quiet, just the sound of the storm outside and the slow breath of sleeping children and the tick of the stove. He said his father had not invented the method he used. His grandfather had taught it to him. His grandfather's father before that. Each generation refining it slightly, correcting what had failed, preserving what had held. The knowledge was not one man's knowledge. It was the accumulated answer to a question that had been asked and answered and asked again over more winters than any living person could count. He had carried that knowledge through every place he had ever lived, through every winter. The knowledge that a house is not furniture. It is not comfort. It is an argument you make against the weather, and the argument has to be sound, or it loses. He looked at Ingrid when he said this last part. She looked back at him. Across the room, she saw Harlan Marsh watching her with a quiet expression she didn't try to name. Croft's daughter had not spoken since they arrived. This was the thing that Ingrid kept returning to even as she moved through the room, even as she managed the stove and the water and the arrangements of sleeping bodies. The little girl. Her name was Nora, Marta had told her, 4 years old. Generally a child who talked so continuously that her father had taken to gently covering her mouth with his hand in church, had not said a single word. She sat in her father's lap with her face turned into his chest and her small hands clutching his coat, and she simply was not talking. Croft held her with the stillness of a man who is frightened, but has decided that his fear is not allowed to show, because if it shows, the child he is holding will know it. Ingrid had seen this before, not in a person, in animals. The absolute withdrawal of a creature that has experienced something beyond its understanding and has gone somewhere internal while it waits for the world to become comprehensible again. She didn't approach them directly. She had learned from Finn that direct approaches were not always the right approach. Finn had been making his rounds of the room since the first arrivals came in, moving from person to person with the calm, deliberate attention of a creature who understood his function had expanded tonight. He had sat beside Silas Wren for a while as the man stared at nothing and slowly came back to himself. He had pressed against Marta Croft's leg until her breathing evened out. He had settled near the children by the stove and let them use him as a pillow without complaint. Now he moved toward Nora. He didn't hurry. He didn't approach Croft. He approached the empty space on the floor just to the left of Croft's boot, and he lay down there, and he put his head on his paws, and he was simply present, warm and solid and breathing slowly and asking nothing. Nora's face turned slightly toward the sound of him settling. She didn't move, didn't reach out, just oriented, the way a plant orients without deciding to. Ingrid watched from across the room and kept doing what she was doing, and did not draw attention to it. It took perhaps 20 minutes, maybe more. Time had become strange in the storm, elastic and unreliable, and she had stopped tracking it with any precision. What happened was small. Nora's hand uncurled from her father's coat, just the one hand. It moved, slowly, and found the edge of Finn's back, and rested there, barely touching. A contact so light it was almost not a contact. Testing, checking whether the warmth was real. Finn did not move, did not raise his head, just breathed. The small hand settled, and then, after another long moment, a child's voice, so quiet it was almost under the sound of the storm. "Is the dog warm?" The room did not react loudly. It was not that kind of moment. It was the kind of moment that asked for stillness, and the room, without discussing it, gave the moment what it asked for. Croft's head went down. His shoulders moved once. Marta put her hand on his arm without looking at him, the gesture of a woman who has been beside someone long enough to know what is needed before it is asked for. Ingrid turned toward the stove and busied herself with the pot. She kept her back to the room until her own expression was under control. When she turned back, Theo was sitting beside Nora with Finn between them, and the little girl was still not speaking, but her hand was moving slowly along the dog's back, and Theo was watching this with the patient gravity of a child who understands without being told that some things require time, and that time, right now, was the one thing they had. The night deepened. The storm did not stop. She had stopped expecting it to stop and had arrived at a different relationship with it. Not acceptance exactly, more like the recognition that it was a fact, the way winter itself was a fact, and facts did not respond to wanting them to be otherwise. She moved through the room one more time, checked on the children, checked the stove, added one careful piece of wood, and no more. Checked the door lashing, which was holding. She pressed her hands flat against the interior wall, feeling for vibration, for the tremor that would tell her something was under stress that shouldn't be. She felt nothing. The walls were still. The hide shell outside was holding against whatever the storm was throwing at it, locked in its frozen tension, shedding the pressure the way a curved hull sheds a wave. Not fighting it, she thought, letting it pass around. She came back to the table and found Harlan sitting there, quiet, a cup in his hands. The rest of the room had settled toward sleep. Not fully, some of them, but the half-sleep of exhausted people who have decided that closing their eyes is the most useful thing left to do. She sat down across from him. Neither of them said anything for a while. This was something she had noticed about him early, that he had the rare quality of not filling silence with noise, of being able to sit in a room with another person without requiring the room to be more than it was. "The Willett house," he said eventually, his voice low, careful. "He hadn't been to the door when I checked." She had heard this already. One of the other men had said it when they first came in, the old man at the end of the valley, the one who had lived alone since his wife passed. He had been on the list of houses she had tried to warn. He had gone back inside without responding one way or another, and she had not known whether that meant he had listened or simply withdrawn. "He knew how to manage," she said. "He did." Harlan looked at the cup. "He's managed alone for a long time." The heaviness of what wasn't being said settled between them. She sat with it. She didn't try to move around it. "I should have gone back," she said. "You went to 7 houses," Harlan said. "You were turned away from all of them. I should have gone back." He didn't argue with her. She respected that. He let the thing be what it was. Not manageable, not fixable with better framing. Just the weight of a true thing that did not have a comfortable version. After a while, he said, "My wife was sick for 2 years before she died." She looked at him. "There was a winter, the second winter, where I thought the cold was going to do it before the illness did." He was quiet for a moment. "I kept the stove burning day and night. I slept beside it. I used twice what we needed and borrowed what I didn't have." He turned the cup in his hands. "The house was warm. She died anyway. In spring." Ingrid waited. "I'm not sure why I'm telling you that," he said. "I think you are," she said. He looked at her then. The first time since they had sat down that he had looked at her directly. She met his eyes. The lamplight was low, and the room was full of sleeping people, and the storm continued outside, relentless and indifferent, and the moment between them was very quiet and very still. His hand was on the table between them. She reached out and placed her hand over his, briefly, just briefly, the contact of a few seconds, and then drew it back. He did not move. His eyes traveled from the place where her hand had been, and then back up to her face, and there was something in his expression that was careful and serious, and not at all unhappy. They sat in companionable silence until the lamp burned very low, and neither of them moved to turn it up. Theo's fever broke as the storm began to change. It didn't end, not yet. Not all at once, but something shifted in it, some quality of absolute commitment softening by a fraction. The way very long and difficult things sometimes give the first signal of ending not with a change you can see, but with a change you can feel. A lessening of that pressure that had been the storm's most distinctive feature. Ingrid felt it in her sleep. She had finally slept, sitting against the wall beside Theo, who had been restless and warm with fever for hours. She felt the change before she was fully awake, and when she opened her eyes and put her hand to his forehead, the difference was immediate and unmistakable. Cool, not cold. Not the cold of the room, not the terrible cold of a body that had stopped fighting. The ordinary coolness of a child who has come through something and arrived at the other side. She sat for a long time with her hand on his forehead. He opened his eyes after a while. They were clear. He looked at her with the slightly dazed expression of a person returning from a long way away. "Hi, Mama," he said. She pressed her lips together and did not let herself make any sound. She pulled him close and held him and felt his small arms come around her neck with the full, unconscious trust of a child who does not yet know how much they have frightened someone and would be sorry if they did. "Hi, sweetheart," she said when she could. Across the room, Nora was asleep against Finn's side. Croft sat awake nearby, watching his daughter breathe in the warmth, and when he looked up and met Ingrid's eyes across the room, he said nothing. He just looked at her for a moment with a face that had been completely emptied of the version of himself he had presented to the world for as long as she had known him. And what was left underneath was simply a man who had been very afraid for his child, and was no longer afraid. She nodded once. He nodded back. Outside, the storm was lessening. The sound of it changed from the sustained roar that had been the whole world's voice all night to something with gaps in it, pauses, moments where the wind drew breath before the next push. The walls continued to hold. The stove continued to burn. The room continued to be warm. One of the children stirred and asked for water. Ingrid got up and brought it. Then she added a piece of wood to the stove and checked the door and went to the small, high window and looked out at the world. The darkness was beginning to separate from itself. That first gray differentiation of night into almost morning. The snow had buried everything to a depth she couldn't quite estimate. The shapes of the settlement were gone. Everything smoothed and covered and transformed into a landscape that did not look like the place it had been yesterday. But the chimney pipe of the house across the clearing was visible, a thin wisp of smoke from it. Someone had made it through over there. She pressed her forehead briefly against the cold glass. Behind her, the room breathed and slept and lived. She had built a hull. The hull had held. That was the whole of it, really. Not triumph, not vindication, just the plain, enormous fact of it. The storm had come. The thing she had built had held. The people inside it were alive. She went back to her place beside Theo, pulled the blanket over them both, and let herself sleep. The morning came the way mornings come after very long nights, not all at once, but in increments, as though the light was testing whether it was safe to return. The storm had blown itself out some time before dawn. Not dramatically, not with any particular announcement. It had simply stopped, the way a very long argument sometimes stops. Not because anything has been resolved, but because everything that could be said has been said, and there is nothing left to do but be quiet and look at what remains. What remained was a world transformed. Ingrid stepped outside into a silence so complete it had its own weight. The snow lay in drifts that reached the eaves of the houses still standing, and not all of them were. She could see the Croft workshop with its roof partially collapsed on one side. The heavy timber framework buckled under what the storm had piled onto it. The general store had lost its sign entirely and half its front porch. The church stood, but its windows were black and open, the glass gone. The settlement looked as though something enormous had passed through it without caring what it touched. She stood in the cold morning air and looked at all of it. Then she looked at her own house. At the dome of frozen hide rising above the buried walls, its surface unmarked, the chimney pipe intact, a thin thread of smoke still rising into the absolutely still air she had known it would hold. She had built it to hold. But knowing a thing and standing in front of the evidence of it on a cold, quiet morning after the worst night of your life are not the same experience. And she let herself feel the difference for a moment before she went back inside to start the fire. The morning after is its own kind of silence, not the silence of the storm, which had been enormous and total, but the small, careful silence of people who have been frightened together and are now finding their way back to being strangers. The people who had sheltered with her left in ones and twos through the morning, moving back through the snow to find whatever was left of their own places. Most of them did not speak much. Silas Wren went first, without ceremony. He paused at the door and looked back at Ingrid with an expression she could not fully read. Something complicated in it. Something that sat uncomfortably between gratitude and shame. And she understood that what a man feels when he owes his life to someone he has publicly mocked is not a simple thing to carry. "I'll send supplies," he said. Not an apology, a statement. "Whatever you need, don't worry about payment." She nodded. He went. Reverend Cray left with the small, careful dignity of a man who is thinking very hard about something. He stopped at the door and turned. "Mrs. Solberg," he said. Then he stopped. He tried again. "I owe you," and stopped again. She waited. "I will say what needs to be said on Sunday," he said finally, "from the pulpit, where it should be said." She looked at him. "Mr. Willett," she said, "someone should go to him." The Reverend's face changed. He had already known, she thought. He had been carrying it since some time in the night when someone had said the name. "I'll go," he said. "I'll go now." He left without another word. The Crofts were the last to leave because of Nora. The little girl had slept deeply once she had finally slept, and woke up in the late morning with the slightly bewildered air of a child who has lost track of time and finds herself in an unfamiliar place with familiar people, and is not sure how to arrange these facts. She looked at the room. She looked at Finn. She looked at Theo. "Is this your house?" she asked Theo. Her voice was small and slightly rusty, but it was working. "Yes," Theo said. "It's warm," she said. "I know," he said. Croft had been standing by the door for a while, coat on, watching his daughter come back to herself. He held himself differently this morning. Not diminished exactly, but reconfigured. Something had been set down. Ingrid thought he had put down the posture of authority he had been carrying so long, he'd forgotten it wasn't his skeleton. When Marta finally gathered Nora and moved toward the door, Croft stayed behind. He waited until it was just the two of them, Ingrid and him, and Finn sleeping by the cold stove, and the empty cups and blankets and the comfortable disorder of a room that had been lived in hard for a night. He looked at the wall where the drawings had been pinned, the two small nail holes. He had noticed those, she thought. A man like Croft noticed things like that. He looked at the dome of the ceiling, the willow frame visible in its elegant curve, the structure she had built from a dead father's drawings and a set of principles that everyone in this settlement had told her didn't apply here. Then he reached up and took off his hat, which she had never seen him do outside of the church. He held it in both hands and looked at her. "I called this a coffin," he said. "You did," she said. "I was wrong." The words came out level and unvarnished. No cushioning, no justification, no detour through explanation. Just the fact of it, stated plainly. The way a man states a measurement he has checked twice and found to be what it is. I was wrong about the structure. I was wrong about you. He paused. I am sorry for the name, for the sign. Another pause. For the betting. She had known about the betting. She had always known. You always knew, in a settlement this size, even the things people thought they were keeping from you. Mr. Croft, she said, will you come back when you're ready? I'll show you how it works. He looked at her for a moment. I'll come tomorrow, he said. He put his hat back on and went out into the snow. She found out about old Willett that afternoon. Reverend Cray came back with the news himself, which she respected. He came to the door and told her plainly. The old man had been found in his house, in his chair by the cold stove. He had gone peacefully, as far as anyone could tell. He had simply run out of wood and warmth and time in that quiet order. She stood in the doorway and received this information. She had gone to his house. She had stood on his step. He had come to the door and looked at the sky and gone back inside, and she had not known whether that meant he had taken her warning or dismissed it, and she had moved on to the next house because there were more houses and not enough time. She would wonder for a long time whether going back would have changed it, whether if she had knocked a second time or a third, he would have gathered what he needed and come to her before the storm arrived. She would never know. That was the cruelty of that kind of wondering. It offered no resolution, only the permanent, unresolvable question. He didn't have to die, she said. Reverend Cray did not offer her comfort. She was glad for that. He simply stood in the cold outside her door and accepted the weight of the words with her. No, he said, he didn't. She looked past him at the transformed landscape, at the settlement piecing itself back together in the thin winter light, people moving through the snow between houses, checking on each other, beginning the long work of repair. The service should be soon, she said, before the cold settles back in. Sunday, he said. I'll say what he deserves to have said about him. She nodded. He went. She stood in the doorway, alone for a while. Finn came and pressed against her leg. She put her hand on his head and stood there until the cold made further standing impractical. And then she went inside and built the fire up and put on the pot and let the work carry her forward, because that was what work was for. Not to avoid the grief, but to give you something to do with your hands while you held it. She thought about Willett a great deal in the days that followed. Not with guilt, exactly, or not only with guilt. More with the specific, unresolvable sadness of a thing that could not be undone and could not be explained away. He had been a man who lived alone and managed his own affairs and had not asked for her concern, and she had given it anyway in the only way she knew how, which was to go to his door and say plainly what she thought was coming. He had heard her. She believed that. The way he had stood on his porch and looked at the sky, that long, quiet look, had not been the look of a man dismissing what he was told. It had been the look of a man who had heard something and was deciding what to do with it. He had gone inside. She had moved on. She did not know what he had decided in those last hours, sitting in his chair by the cold stove. She did not know if he had thought about coming to her and chosen not to, or if the storm had arrived too quickly, or if there had been something else entirely. She would never know. That was the truth of it, and she had learned slowly and at some cost that the truth of a thing does not become more bearable simply because you understand it better. Sometimes it just stays what it is. Edmund came 3 days later. She had been expecting him, not expecting him to apologize, not expecting any particular version of reckoning, but expecting him the way you expect weather you have been watching build. It was simply a matter of time. He arrived alone, on foot, in the mid-morning when Theo was at his lessons, and the house was quiet. He knocked. She opened the door. He looked different, not diminished. Edmund Hale was not a man who diminished easily, and she did not think anything short of death would take the fundamental solidity out of him. But something had shifted in his bearing. Something had been adjusted slightly in the way he occupied himself. He was still large, still certain of his own specific gravity. But he was looking at her now, actually looking, not past or above or around, in a way he had not done in the entire time she had known him. She let him in. He sat at the table. She did not offer him coffee. She did not perform the rituals of hospitality for this visit. She simply took the tin box from under the floorboard, removed the deed, and placed it on the table between them. She sat across from him and said nothing. He looked at the document. He looked at the name at the top. Her father's name. At the name at the bottom. Hers. At the date. And the official stamps. And the witness signatures. He read it the way a man reads something he is hoping to find a flaw in, and she watched him not find one. The silence lasted a long time. Finally, he set the document down. He placed both hands flat on the table. He looked at her. "Your father was a clever man," he said. His voice was even, not warm. There was nothing warm about Edmund Hale, and that was simply a fact about him, like the color of his eyes. But there was something in it she had not heard there before, a flatness that was the sound, she thought, of a man who has run out of the energy it takes to be wrong in public. She said nothing. He sat there a moment longer. Then he reached into his coat pocket and placed something on the table beside the deed. The leather cylinder, her father's drawings. She looked at it, then at him. "I have no use for them," he said. A pause. "They were never mine." She said nothing in return. She simply placed her hand on the cylinder and drew it toward her. Edmund Hale stood. He picked up his hat from where he had set it on the table. He put it on with the deliberate, unhurried motion of a man who does everything in his own time. He buttoned his coat. He looked at her one more time across the table. She looked back. The room was quiet. Outside, the light on the snow was bright and cold and indifferent. She stood at the window for a long time after he left. The clearing was empty. The cottonwood trees stood bare and white against the sky. She had waited a long time for that conversation, and now that it was over, she found she had nothing particular to feel about it. Only a quiet, settled sense of completion, the way a structure feels when the last fitting is tightened and the whole thing simply stands. "I never wished you dead," he had said at the door. "I want you to know that." "I know," she had said. He went to the door. He opened it. The cold came in briefly. "The boy," he said with his back to her. "He has good hands. I noticed that. He'll be a builder, I think." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "He will." Edmund nodded, almost to himself, and stepped out into the snow. She watched him walk, that heavy, deliberate walk, each step placed with the full commitment of a man who has never been uncertain about where his feet belong, until he had crossed the clearing and gone around the stand of cottonwood trees and was gone. She did not see him again after that. Croft came the next day, as he had said he would. He came with his tools and without his certainty, which was a significant change in his equipment, and he stood in the yard and looked at the structure for a long time before he said anything. She let him look. She understood that he was doing what she had done with the drawings, reading it, translating it, feeling for the principle that had been invisible to him before. "The curve," he said finally. "The curve," she confirmed. "It distributes." He traced the line of it in the air with one hand. "Like an arch. You don't need the mass if you have the geometry." "My father used to say that geometry is just the truth about shapes," she said, "and the truth doesn't need a lot of material to hold." Croft looked at her. Something in his face was doing the careful work of incorporating a new idea. Not easy work for a man who had built his professional identity around the rightness of certain methods, but genuine work. She respected that. "Will you show me the fittings?" he said. She showed him the fittings. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, Ingrid explaining and Croft asking questions. Real questions, the kind that came from genuine curiosity rather than skepticism, the kind that built on the answer they received rather than simply waiting for an opening to disagree. He was, she found, an extremely skilled listener when he had decided to listen. The same intelligence that had made him so certain she was wrong turned out to be formidable when it was pointed in a different direction. By the time the light faded, he understood the system. She could see it in him. The moment of comprehension, not dramatic, just a slight reordering of the expression, a settling into place. He stood and looked at the frozen dome, and she thought he was probably building it in his mind, running through the sequence, testing it against what he knew. There was a long silence. "The reason it works," he said finally, slowly, as though working it out as he spoke, "is not the hide itself. It's the air between the hide and the old roof." "Yes," she said. "You've built two roofs, one on top of the other, and the space between them, that dead air, is what does the work." "My father said still air is the best insulator in nature," she said. "It can't carry heat away because it isn't moving. You just have to keep it still." Croft was quiet for a long time after that. He looked at the roof with the expression of a man revising a significant assumption. "I've been fighting the cold for 20 years, he said at last. "Building heavier walls, bigger stoves, more wood." "More wood," she agreed. "And you." He stopped, started again. "You didn't fight it at all. You just shut the door on it." "My father's words exactly," she said. "He said, don't argue with the winter. Just refuse to let it in." Croft stood there for a moment longer. Then he picked up his tools. "My roof," he said. "When you're ready." "Spring," he said. "I want to do it right." "Spring," she agreed. He gathered his tools. At the gate he stopped. "The sign," he said. He looked down at the snow. "I had boys take it down this morning. The one at the store, and the one I put up here, at the property line." He stopped. "I put it up. I should say that plainly. It was my idea, and I should own it." A pause. "I'm sorry for it." She looked at him in the fading light. "Mr. Croft," she said, "come in spring. Bring your tools. Bring your sons if they want to learn." He nodded, went. The weeks after the storm had a different quality to them, quieter, more deliberate, as though the people of the settlement had been shaken loose from their old habits of assumption and were moving through their days with more care. Harlan came to dinner regularly now, irregular enough to maintain the form of casualness, but regular enough that Theo had started setting 3 places at the table without being asked. He had brought a small piece of ham from somewhere, and Ingrid had made cornbread, and they ate together with the easy conversation of people who have found a rhythm that works. After dinner, Theo took Finn and went to his corner with a book, which Ingrid had the impression he did with a certain deliberateness, though she chose not to examine that impression too carefully. Harlan helped her clear the table. They stood at the basin together washing the plates, and she was aware of the quality of the silence, the way it had shifted from the ordinary silence of companionable people working together to something with a different texture. He put down the plate he was drying, turned slightly toward her. "I should tell you something," he said. She waited. "I have been coming here," he said, "for a while now, to see about Theo's lessons." He paused. "That has not been, for some time, the real reason I have been coming here." She looked at him. He was looking at the plate in the basin, and then he looked up and met her eyes with the direct, slightly nervous honesty of a man who has decided that indirectness has cost him enough in his life, and he is done with it. "I thought you should know," he said, "that the real reason is you." The room was quiet. The fire ticked. From the corner, Finn made a small sound in his sleep. "I have a dead husband's name," she said. "A house made of rawhide. A child who will always be my first concern. $11 when I came here, spent on cowhide." She paused. "And a deed to this land, which I intend to keep." "I know all of that," he said. "You know some of it." "I know enough," he said, "and I'd like, if you're willing, to come to know the rest." She looked at him for a long moment, at the worn-in face, the patient eyes, the hands that had fixed her door without being asked and asked nothing in return. "Ask me again in spring," she said, "when the season has changed." He smiled. Not disappointed, something lighter than that. The smile of a man who has planted something and is genuinely content to wait for it. "In spring," he said. She turned back to the basin. He picked up the cloth and went back to drying. From the corner, Theo turned a page with the elaborate casualness of a child who has heard every word and is pretending otherwise. She said nothing, but she let herself smile at the basin where no one could see it. Spring came reluctantly, then all at once. The snow releasing the land back to itself in a slow, steady reclamation that filled the air with the smell of cold water and thawed earth, and the freshness of a world that has come through something and is prepared to continue. Croft came with his sons and his tools and spent 3 days rebuilding his own roof, with Ingrid working beside him. He asked careful questions and received careful answers, and built the thing with the precision of a craftsman who has decided that if he is going to learn something new, he is going to learn it properly. When it was done, he stood back and looked at it, and then knocked his knuckles against the hide surface, and listened to the sound it made. He said nothing, but the expression on his face was its own kind of speech. He taught his neighbor the following week. The neighbor taught his brother-in-law. The brother-in-law told the men at the general store. Silas Wren, converted thoroughly by direct experience, began stocking the specific grade of rope and the tension fittings Gustav had designed, and within 1 season had developed a small but steady trade in the materials that the new method required. Nobody called it Solberg's Folly anymore. They called it the Hull method, which was not a name Ingrid had given it. It was a name that had simply emerged from the people using it, the way names emerge when something needs to be called something, and the right word is simply the one that fits. She thought her father would have found it satisfying. A shipwright's language finding its way onto the prairie, one roof at a time. She told Harlan yes in spring, as she had said she would. Or more precisely, she did not tell him yes to anything. She simply told him, on a morning in early spring when the ground was soft and the cottonwoods were beginning to show their first green, that she had thought about what he had said in the winter. And she had thought about it carefully, and she was prepared to let him know the rest of it. The parts she hadn't shown anyone. He listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said that he had some parts of himself that hadn't been shown to anyone either, and that seemed like a fair basis for a conversation. They were married in the summer, in the yard of the house with the hull roof, with Theo standing beside Harlan and looking as solemn and proud as a boy of 9 can look, and Gustav Brandt in the front row, and Croft and his family, and the Wren family, and Reverend Cray, who said the words he had been given to say, with a genuineness that she had come to believe was real. Edmund Hale was not there. She had not expected him to be. The years passed the way years do when you are building something. Not quickly, not slowly. One thing following another in the ordinary and extraordinary accumulation of a life being lived. Theo grew. He had, as Edmund had observed, with the uncomfortable accuracy of a man who noticed things even when he preferred not to. Good hands. And he grew into them, into the patience and spatial intelligence, and the satisfaction of understanding how things fit together that were her father's legacy running forward through the generations. He built his first roof when he was 12, his second when he was 14, for a widow 2 settlements over who had heard about the Hull method from her cousin and had written to ask if someone would come and show her. Theo went with Ingrid beside him and showed her. The first time Theo went alone, without Ingrid beside him, he was 16 years old, and the farmer 3 settlements north was skeptical in the way that experienced men are skeptical, not cruelly, but with a thoroughness that required careful answering. Theo answered him carefully. By the end of the second day, the farmer was asking questions Ingrid herself had never thought to ask. Theo came home that evening and said nothing about it, only sat down to dinner with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has discovered they can do something they weren't entirely sure they could. Ingrid watched him eat and thought, "There it is. There is the chain." That widow Theo had taught told someone else, who told someone else, who wrote a letter. Knowledge traveled the only way useful things travel. Person to person, roof to roof, one winter at a time. Houses that used the Hull method were warmer. They used less fuel. They held through conditions that collapsed other structures. People noticed this. People talked about it. People built them. What struck Ingrid most, watching it spread, was how little explanation it required. She had spent weeks trying to explain the principle to people who refused to hear it. Now the same principle was being passed from neighbor to neighbor, settlement to settlement, without argument or persuasion, simply because the roofs it produced were self-evidently better than the roofs they replaced. The evidence was the argument. The winter, in the end, was the most convincing teacher. She thought about that sometimes. How much time and effort and heartbreak goes into trying to explain a true thing to people who are not ready to hear it. And how, when the time is right, the true thing explains itself. She could not have predicted the storm. She could not have arranged for it to arrive precisely when it did, to test precisely what needed testing in front of precisely the people who needed to see it. It had simply happened, the way true things sometimes do, as though the world itself has a preference for demonstration over argument. Her father would have had something to say about that too. He always did. Nora Croft grew up. She remembered the night of the storm the way very young children sometimes remember formative things. Not as a narrative, not as a sequence of events, but as an impression. The warmth, the dog, the calm at the center of something frightening. She told her own children about it years later, speaking in the imprecise and luminous language of early memory, and they told their children. Gustav Brandt lived to see 36 hull roofs in the settlement before he died one autumn morning, quietly, in the smithy where he had worked for 40 years. They buried him with one of the tension fittings he had designed, because Ingrid said those were the thing he had been most proud of, and she thought she was right about that. His name was not on any sign. It did not need to be. Every roof that held carried his work inside it, and that was the kind of memorial a man like Gustav would have preferred. Croft commissioned a small iron marker for the smithy door, not a gravestone, just a plate, simple and direct, the kind of thing a craftsman would recognize as appropriate. It read, Gustav Brandt. He built things to hold. That was all. It was enough. Finn grew old in the good way of a dog well loved, slowly, comfortably, his muzzle going white and his movements becoming more deliberate, but his essential nature unchanged. He kept watch until the last of his watching was done, and when he went the same way he had lived, quietly, without fuss, in the place by the door he had claimed as his own on his very first night. They buried him under a flat stone at the edge of the property, in the shade of the cottonwood trees, and Theo carved his name in it with the careful precision of a craftsman who has learned that some things deserve to be done properly. Finn, he kept watch. She stood at the stone for a long time, the morning after they buried him. Harlan stood beside her. He didn't say anything, which was exactly right. She had long since stopped being surprised by his rightness. It was one of those qualities in him that she had come to simply rely on, the way you rely on a level floor or a true wall. She was not sorry, she thought. That was the strange thing about grief. Not that it hurt, but that it was so thoroughly the correct response to the correct thing. She had loved that animal. He had been part of the life she had built here, one of the elements she had not planned and had found to be essential. It was right to grieve him. She let herself do that fully, and then she went inside and made breakfast, and that was that. A traveler came through in one of the later summers, a young man with an engineer's bearing and an engineer's habit of looking at structures and asking questions about them. He was passing through on his way to somewhere else, and he had been told by 2 different people in 2 different settlements to stop here and look at the roofs. He walked around the settlement for an afternoon, looking up. He asked to see inside several of the houses, and the owners let him in. And he took notes in a small book with the focused attention of someone who was learning something he hadn't expected to find. He came to Ingrid's house last. She was in the yard working, and she let him look and ask what he needed to ask. He asked about the principle. She explained it the way she explained everything, plainly, starting with the fundamentals, not simplifying but not elaborating beyond what was useful. He asked where it had come from. My father was a shipwright, she said. He thought about houses the way he thought about ships. He was more interested in keeping things out than in what you used to fight them. The young man nodded slowly, writing something down. And he built this? He drew it, she said. I built it. He looked up from his book. How long ago? She thought about it. Years had a way of filling themselves when the hands kept moving. A life that began in loss and cold, and $11 and a dead man's drawings had become, through the simple repetition of one day following another, with the hands moving and the mind working and the heart held steady, large, full, genuinely itself. Long enough, she said. He thanked her and went on his way. The final scene came on an ordinary evening. She was old by then, not frail, not diminished, but old in the way of someone who has been shaped thoroughly by what they have done. The years of building and teaching and choosing and losing and continuing, all visible in her, as visible as the work of a life is in the work of the hands. She sat on the porch in the late afternoon light, the kind of light that comes at the end of a winter day when the sun is low and the snow catches it sideways, and everything becomes briefly golden and improbable. Her granddaughter climbed up beside her, a serious child of about 7, with her father's hands and her great-grandfather's way of looking at things. That quality of attention turned outward, gathering. She looked at the hull roof, the latest one. They had rebuilt it twice over the years, each time with the same principle and better materials, each time lasting longer than the one before. "Grandma," the child said, "were you scared back then?" It was the kind of question children ask with great directness and no cruelty. Genuine, expecting a genuine answer, uninterested in the comfortable version. Ingrid looked at the roof, at the cottonwood trees, bare in the winter cold, at the flat stone at the edge of the property where the lettering had softened with years of weather but was still legible if you knew where to look. Every single night, she said. The child considered this. "Then how did you keep going?" The light was doing that thing it did in winter, spreading low and gold across the snow, making everything very clear and very still. "Your great-grandfather's drawings were on the wall," she said, "and your father was asleep inside." She paused. "When those two things are true, you keep going. That's all. You just keep going." The child was quiet for a moment. Then, "Will you teach me?" What he knew. Ingrid looked at her granddaughter, at the serious face, the careful eyes, the hands that would someday build things she couldn't yet imagine. "Yes," she said, "I will teach you everything." She meant it exactly as she said it. Not the technical drawings. Those were already written down, copied out in 3 different hands now, stored in 3 different places the way her father had stored the deed, in the seam, where no one would think to look for something important. Not just the method, the measurements, the angles of the frame, and the specific grade of rope, and the way the tension fittings locked. She meant everything her father had meant when he taught her. The habit of looking at a problem and asking not how to fight it, but how to understand it. The instinct to look for where the true work was happening, which was never where it appeared to be happening. The patience to build something that would not prove itself until it was tested, and the willingness to go on building anyway without the test. The knowledge that the seam is where you put what you most need to protect, that the place that looks like nothing is often the place that holds everything, that a hull is not just a shape, but a philosophy, a decision made in wood and rope and hide and frozen air, that some things should not be able to enter regardless of how hard they try. She had not understood all of this when her father gave it to her. She had understood it slowly, over time, the way you understand things that matter, not in a moment of clarity, but in an accumulation of mornings, each one adding a small increment to something that was being built without your full awareness of it. She understood it now. The chain of it. Her father to her to Theo, Theo to his children to theirs. Knowledge moving forward through time the way water moves, finding the lowest place, the path of least resistance, the route that opens when you stop fighting the terrain and learn to work with it instead, not fighting the cold, refusing to let it in. The light faded. The first stars appeared in the darkening sky above the hull roof. She sat on the porch with her granddaughter pressed warm against her side, and the house held its heat behind them, and the world outside was cold and beautiful and entirely manageable. There is a kind of wisdom that does not announce itself. It does not come with authority or credentials or the approval of those who consider themselves qualified to judge. It comes wrapped in rawhide and tied with a strip of leather, stored in a broken house at the edge of a settlement where nobody is looking, waiting for the person whose name is written on the outside to come and collect it. It comes from fathers who built ships and thought about houses, from mothers who stayed when everything said to leave, from children who kept faith in drawings on walls, from dogs who kept watch at doors. It comes from the decision, made in a cold room with 3 matches and a sick child, and no particular reason for optimism, to understand the problem correctly and then solve it. It comes from the willingness to be wrong in public, to have your name put on a sign, to hear it said with laughter, to watch from 30 feet away as men shake their heads and walk on, and to keep working anyway, because the principle is sound, and the principle will prove itself in its own time. And your job is simply to still be standing when it does. It comes from knowing the difference between a fight you can win by fighting and a fight you can only win by refusing to fight, by building something so tight that the thing you are afraid of simply cannot find a way in. She did not fight the winter. She refused to let it in. And that, in the end, made all the difference. If you are facing your own storm right now, if the cold is at your walls, and the people around you are certain you cannot hold, remember her. Build it tight. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment. All characters and events are entirely imaginary.